Welcome to today's Community Cast. My name is Matt Morgan. I'm the pastor at Community Brookside, a new church plant in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We are so blessed by your presence, and we hope that today's content will bring you joy. So we're here today with Rich Gable, our Director of Worship Arts, who is a good friend of mine and been a good friend of mine for the last, 100 years.
Yeah,
it's crazy. It's crazy that we still look so young. But anyway, we have decided to come and have a conversation about Israel. This is going to be the first in a series of podcasts that we're working on, where we just talk about United Methodism. We talk about Christianity, our response to world events, and it's going to be an opportunity for us to be in conversation with one another and to just share our hearts. One of the things I want to just take a second and say is that we live in a time in America where we have been more divided than we've ever been. And I think it's important for us to be able to have calm conversation so that we can actually listen to what other people understand and believe. And the great news is, you may not agree with anything I have to say today, Rich, right? Like, often he doesn't.
I usually don't. Yeah. That's true.
But the great news is we work together super well. And that's not necessarily true. I think Rich and I do see eye to eye on just about everything for the most part. And I just want to remind you that even if you disagree with everything that Rich and I talk about today, it's not a grounds for us to hate one another or be mean to one another or disrespectful or post comments about how, so-and-so is going to go to hell because they believe this thing differently than I do. This is just a conversation that I have to be honest, very few people in America are knowledgeable enough to have. And I think that includes us. Like, we are just a couple of schlubs that are just here trying to start a conversation that I think is important for us as believers to talk about. So, Rich, I know that you know some things about Israel. I know some things about Israel. Both of us combined know very few things about Israel. So, what are your thoughts as of this moment? Like, what do you know about Israel?
The whole thing is kind of interesting. Growing up in church, you kind of have, and I mean capital C church. What's been interesting is I was in a United Methodist Church for a long time growing up, but have not been a part of one for the last probably 20 years or so. Life has taken me other directions. Sure. and gotten lots of very cool experiences. But to say all that, I've been in a lot of kind of the charismatic movement. There's been a lot of, whatever happens, we stand with Israel. Mm-hmm. So, walking into something, I think there's always this, you're kind of walking on eggshells around the topic because you're supposed to stand with Israel and you're right. Supposed to have all of these thoughts and if Israel is under attack, then it must be the end of times. That's
every time. Yes,
yeah.
Every time there is any sort of movement, it seems like everybody's reaching for these prophecies being fulfilled.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. This is in Revelation. This is Israel. This has got to be it. Mm-hmm. Jesus is coming tomorrow. It's kind of interesting. As far as that goes, being in that world, hearing no matter what, we stand with Israel. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of where this conversation is leading up to.
Yeah.
Talking about where United Methodists stand. What do we believe? Mm-hmm. Where do we go from there? And I think it's a conversation that really needs to happen. Yeah. It's something that we need to talk about.
Well, and in fairness, this conversation spawned out of a message I received just a couple of days after the Hamas attack on Israel. And so we know that Israel, it happened in the middle of some sort of like a concert, like out in the desert. I don't know all the details of that, but it was almost like this very progressive kind of hippie-ish movement happening out in the desert. And Hamas, which is the elected leadership of the Palestinians since 2014, I believe, they flew in via like these motorized gliders
Mm.
and started murdering people at this event that was happening out in the desert. And it wasn't just it wasn't only Israelis that they murdered. It was anybody who was there. I mean, they've taken a number of people from all over the world who were at this event as hostage back to parts of the Palestinian West Bank and in Gaza. And it's just this message that I got was like, hey, Pastor, where do we stand in support of Israel? I hope that we're praying for all the innocent people whose lives are lost, both Palestinians and Israelis. But where do we as a church stand? I hope that you're taking a strong stance for Israel. And my response was not one that this person wanted to hear, because spoiler alert: the United Methodist Church believes that war is wrong. It's incompatible with the teachings of Christ. And if you know anything about the gospel of Jesus, Jesus was an advocate for turning the other cheek, loving your enemy. The radical, extravagant love of God is expressed most perfectly through Jesus. And Jesus was never an advocate of war. So, so I think I've kind of jumped ahead in that conversation, but I think all of this talk that you and I are going to have today, it references what happened on October 7th when the Hamas extremist attack happened in Israel. And what I've heard is that this is a comparison from the Israeli standpoint to us as Americans with our World Trade Center 9/11 experience. So for them, it's kind of that same amount of loss of life. Just incredibly devastating for their people and heart-wrenching for those who their families have still not been reunited, because there are still people missing, still people in captivity, and some we just have no idea where they are. So all of this is heartbreaking. But I think we have ingrained our religious communities to support Israel. And as you mentioned, no matter what. And I think, personally, I've said this multiple times, I think that we have a very unhealthy relationship in America with Israel. And I think most of it stems from what you were talking about. This, we recognize that the book of Revelation and Daniel and some of these other apocalyptic books in Scripture, or at least the prophetic and apocalyptic writings, point to Israel being the place where Jesus is going to show up again. Like everybody will recognize that all these things are happening in the Middle East, and where Israel once, claimed its homeland, and because of that, I think we as Americans try to usher in the end times. Like it's a very strange place to be. So I recognize that, and I hear you when you say that, and agree. It's a weird relationship that we have with Israel. So, I mean, we recognize that there's like competing interests in this land. And one of the things, and I've listened to a number of podcasts about the history of ancient Israel and the history of the Palestinian people. And one of the things that I have come to understand is that the folks that lived in that area when Israel was created in 1948, that those people were kin, or at least ancient ancestors of some of those nomadic tribes that lived in that area. So like the Jebusites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, like all of these different tribes lived in that area, and the Palestinians have claimed that as their heritage. I think the land dispute has been going on since thousands of years BC, and it's just it's a weird place for the Western cultures after World War II. Said, hey, we know that the Jews have been persecuted for a long time. There was an anti-Semitic sentiment all throughout Europe, not just during World War II, but previous to that for generations. And somehow the French and English and Americans decided we were going to go ahead and set up a land for the Jews in what was known as ancient Israel. But we had somehow forgotten that before Israel was a thing, there were other claimants to that land. So do you know anything about that, Rich? I mean,
I don't. I mean, when we were kind of getting prepared for things, you had mentioned that it's a lot like the the Native Americans here in America. There were obviously indigenous people that had this land before us, and they're still here. So we're kind of and there are still squabbles and disagreements.
I mean, especially here in Oklahoma.
Yeah,
I mean, we've
yeah.
experienced that with the fact that where we live, there was like the native land, and then Tulsa has been basically applied on top of what was allocated as Native American land. So we have this dualism here where Native Americans have a claim to this land, and they should because they were indigenous to this land first. But then now Tulsans have a claim, and so we run into these issues all the time where if somebody is a Native American citizen of a tribe, do they fall under the American justice system or the Native American justice system? And so there's a lot of unclarity in this. So yeah, keep going, Rich.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We looking back and kind of doing more research. Obviously, growing up in Oklahoma, you go through Oklahoma history, and you hear things about the Trail of Tears, and you find out like, okay, yeah, parts of it ended here, and this is where like the Cherokees, they were given land here, which was taken away,
Right.
But you always hear about the Trail of Tears, and it's kind of just like a title, that's the title of the chapter, if you will. And that's kind of always what I thought of it growing up in grade school, things like that. But when you really dig in and hear some of the stories that were just heart-wrenching, what our government and presidents and all of the people who were in charge of America during that time, and since some of the decisions that were made for those tribal people were not good. They were not fair.
That is a very diplomatic way to say that we messed up big time as a part of our history. And
exactly.
And recently we've had this kind of a move on both the conservative side and liberal side to both forget history and then also to reclaim our history, like remember. And it's been made most evident in things like that came later. So post-slavery, after after the Civil War, we talked about how it was only after the Civil War, like decades after the Civil War, that some of the first Confederate monuments were placed. And now we're talking about in, post the I can't remember when we began this conversation, but taking down some of these conservative, or not conservative, but the Confederate monuments, and how some people consider that erasing history. Well, there are some parts of our history that will never be able to be erased because it's ingrained in the lives of people who have been subjugated and denigrated for generations. But also there's a difference between erasing history and taking down monuments to generals who fought against our country to maintain slavery and lost.
Yeah.
I get some people fight valiantly, and some families have, history where they are appreciative of the sacrifices made of those members, great grandfathers or what have you, who fought in the Civil War and made the ultimate sacrifice for what they at that point believed. But do we continue to make monuments for those folks if they fought on the wrong side of evil, right?
Yeah, they celebrate it.
Right.
Yeah.
And certainly we know better today that we would never, I don't know anybody who would say, let's go ahead and put up a monument of Adolf Hitler, right? I just don't think that would happen. And yet there are voices who are fighting to maintain these Confederate monuments. These are red-blooded American citizens, patriotic to the core, who say, let's maintain these Confederate monuments, even though they were losing against a battle against our country. So I just don't get the mentality there, and people hide behind the phrase, Southern pride.
Sure.
Well, go drink a sweet tea, and let's take down the Confederate flag. Let's take down the Confederate monuments. because those things no longer have a place. I don't know all of the history of the ancient Near East. I know quite a bit of it stems from, and let me be clear, as a Christian, most of the history that I know about Israel and the land that Israel inhabits comes from Scripture, comes from the Old Testament, comes from the stories of Jesus moving about in Jerusalem, which was the capital of the country of Israel at that time. But the history that we get taught, I think, in fairness, is a piece of something, right? So you had mentioned Oklahoma history. And, we get a piece, we get a chapter about the Native American plight, and we hear some of the stories. But I don't know. I mean, I know a number of people, even in our own congregation here, who have a deep and rich Native heritage as a part of their family. And I don't think we do enough to really express how traumatizing it was for these people to be removed from their ancient connection, like the land that they knew, where they hunted and set up, civilizations. And we moved them to a place that was foreign to them, right? So we moved people from the East Coast to places like Oklahoma, Missouri, northern Texas, Kansas. And we gave them some of the most desolate prairie land. I mean, don't get me wrong, the prairie is beautiful and wonderful, but it's not filled with what our ancient Native brothers and sisters would have known. So we gave them what we thought was the worst lands. And just recently, have you had a chance to go see Killers of the Flower Moon?
I have not seen it yet.
So, just recently we had this incredible movie made talking about the history of how we uprooted these Native Americans, moved them to places that they were unfamiliar with, and then we made treaties with them. This is your land. But then once the land, we recognized that there was something productive underneath the land in terms of oil. There was this move where American citizens were poisoning, murdering, stealing land, marrying into the Osage Nation, and murdering their people in order to white people to reclaim a land that they had given away for free to people who already lived here. There's so much of this that is so convoluted that it could easily make you think that, we were just doing what we thought was right at the time.
Yeah.
Just because we thought it was right at the time doesn't mean it was right ever.
Yeah.
And we can't celebrate that history. And this is a really weird way of relating what's going on with Israel and the Palestinian people who live there to, something comparative. But I think that if we're not looking at it in those same terms, we're missing how the Palestinian people might feel that the land that they owned, the land that they had ancient connection to as well. And again, if they do claim tribal connection to the ancient Canaanite tribes of the land, then they have a standing there before Abraham, before Isaac, before Jacob, before what we know as biblical history. Those people were there. And when they came back out of Egypt and then moved back to what they had considered part of their homeland, they fought against people who were intermarried with some of the some of their own ancestors, right? So yeah, all of this is just, when I say all of this, I want us to just basically realize that it's not just as simple as saying we support Israel, because when we say we support Israel, what does that infer? We don't support Palestinians who also have an ancient right and claim to that land. So I think us saying anything about we support this group or that specific group in a war does a lot of damage.
Yeah, it gets tough because we're basically inferring that everyone in Israel is the next step from a God, and they make every correct decision, and they do everything as if it were God's own will, which is not a good stance to have. When you start to look at Israel bombing hospitals and things like that. When you look into hurting innocent people. It's one thing to defend yourself. Like that's, I'm not, definitely not against that. But when you begin to target, innocent lives and things like that for the sake of war, gosh, it's a really weird place to be, and it's a weird, kind of a weird spot to back, to say like, hey, I stand with Israel, so that means I am okay with people bombing a hospital where there are innocent children, and just because of retaliation. That's kind of a really weird spot to be. You have to look at all of the aspects of it.
I agree. So I have this newspaper here, and I don't traditionally get an opportunity to read the newspaper, but I think my wife set this aside for me to read. This is coming from the Tulsa World on Sunday, November 12th. The title of this little section says, "Poll: Americans divided on Israel's response to Hamas attacks," which, duh, right? Mm-hmm. The first paragraph speaks to what you were talking about from Washington. Americans have become more likely to describe Israel as an ally that shares U.S. interests and values since the war with Hamas began, but they're divided over whether Israel has gone too far in its response to last month's attack, according to a new poll from the Associated Press, NORC, Center for Public Affairs Research. And I think that stems from exactly what you're talking about. When you indiscriminately try to launch attacks against an enemy, and you're launching those attacks and it hits hospitals and synagogues and mosques and daycare centers, you are impacting lives that should never be impacted, right? Like that is what is tough about this situation. Well, I say that is another thing that is tough about this situation, because and we have to recognize that Hamas is the legitimate government of the Palestinians at this point, which blows my mind. And again, I did some research and was listening to a podcast about how that developed. And Hamas became the elected leadership over the Palestinians because they were just so tired of the I can't remember what the Fatah group, I think is what it was. But they just broken promise after broken promise after broken promise. We're going to, build a community. We're going to allow the Palestinians to have voice and vote, and we're going to build the government. We're going to take care of the schools. We're going to, develop this area. We're going to, put in all the social structures necessary to provide for you and create a modern society. And it just never happened. There was so much corruption in the government that out of desperation, when Hamas ran people to be elected, they were overwhelmingly elected because they had promised change. And again, so there's this history in the 1980s and 1990s where there were suicide bombers that were sent out by Hamas that damaged and broke relationships with Israel and with other groups in the Middle East. But they were elected because they basically thought they were out of options. The government that they had was so corrupt and so poor at managing, making deals with the Americans and others that didn't actually benefit the people and instead enriched, the folks who were in political power. They were desperate. And so these folks who are the elected government of the Palestinians launched an attack on the Israelis, and it was mind-boggling because it was unexpected, right? And when the Israelis went to retaliate, or have gone back to retaliate multiple times, the Hamas officials, the leadership in the Hamas party, they have hidden themselves in plain sight, basically. They have gone to take refuge in areas that they didn't think Israel would hit. And Israel was just so angry and bitter and devastated over the loss of their, more than 1,000 plus in that initial launch, and I'm sure hundreds since then, that they were willing to do whatever it took to, reach out and touch Hamas in a very detrimental way. It looks awful.
Yeah.
And it is awful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's just kind of circling back to the original idea. That's kind of what we're discussing today is not trying to say we stand against Israel
No,
by
definitely
any
not.
means. It's just we're looking at all the facts and saying, look, there are good and bad things that are happening here. We just don't stand with war. We don't stand behind. We're not going to be a cheerleader.
No, definitely not. And I'm going to pull up, this is another piece of paper here. This comes from the social principles, the social principles of the United Methodist Church. It can be found in our Book of Discipline, and it talks specifically about war and peace. And I just want to read this paragraph. It's actually 2 short paragraphs. It's going to sound long because it's big words, but this is what we believe as a denomination when it comes to war and peace. It says, we believe, first sentence, we believe war is incompatible with the teachings and example of Christ. We therefore reject war as an instrument of national foreign policy. We oppose unilateral first preemptive strike actions and strategies on the part of any government. As disciples of Christ, we are called to love our enemies, seek justice, and serve as reconcilers of conflict. We insist that the first moral duty of all nations is to work together to resolve by peaceful means every dispute that arises between or among them. We advocate the extension and strengthening of international treaties and institutions that provide a framework within the rule of law for responding to aggression, terrorism, and genocide. We believe that human values must outweigh military claims as governments determine their priorities, that the militarization of society must be challenged and stopped, that the manufacture, sale, and deployment of armaments must be reduced and controlled, and that the production, possession, or use of nuclear weapons be condemned. Consequently, we endorse general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. That is a lot that speaks against not just war itself, a declaration of war, but also about how we escalate and get to war. We think that dialogue should be opened before the first shots are fired. We think that every opportunity should be taken in order to disarm and to dissuade nations from fighting other nations. And here's what's crazy. It is, and I don't know the numbers of exactly the residents of Israel who would claim to be Israelis. I almost want to say Israelites because that's the ancient name of the people. But I don't know what the number is of people that are Israeli in the land that is now called Israel versus Palestinians that are in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of a power relation there is between the number of people living in those two different areas. Yeah. And I know that Israelis live a very different life than Palestinians because Palestinians are basically treated as, I don't know what the right word is here, and I don't want to be politically incorrect, but they see Israel as being occupiers of their land. They are treated as second-class citizens, and there are not nearly the same sort of economic opportunities for Palestinians in that land as there are for Israelis. So, and that's not to say that every Israeli man or woman is racist against Palestinians and vice versa, but there definitely is a lot of that happens. There are people who view the opposite as somebody who is foreign and other, and they treat each other in general pretty poorly.
Sure.
So, Rich and I talked a little bit about what we're seeing, and as a pastor, I get asked almost daily by somebody, what are my thoughts? Well, Pastor, do you stand with Israel? No, I don't stand with anybody in war. I try to make that as plain as I can without being insensitive. And I always follow it up with I am praying for all people who are impacted by the evil and injustice that is war in this moment. But I get constantly asked what my thoughts are, how I feel about it, and I default to that United Methodist stance. Like, we take no sides in war. And it's really interesting to hear people I love and respect say things like, well, Matt, the only way that this is going to be resolved is if we nuke them all. Have you heard any of that?
I have, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And by that, like, who is them all, right? Like you want to just literally commit genocide against a whole people group because they are fighting the Israelis who you have an unhealthy relationship and a vastly distorted view of.
Yeah.
I don't get that at all. That mentality of how do you call yourself a Christian and reconcile that with a complete and total genocide, the erasure of a people group from the face of the earth. That is the most anti-Christ thing I have heard. But people tell me that to my face. I've heard that. And it is heartbreaking that we have become so desensitized to the value of human life that anybody that we disagree with can just be eradicated.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of what makes me laugh sometimes, and this is not a political stance. This is not a anti this title at all, but the idea of the Make America Great Again. What that insinuates is that America once was this nation that did amazing things, that that was never at fault and was just this God-fearing nation, that everything that was done with the love of Christ. And then you go back in history and you see things like the Tulsa race riots, which there again sounds very much like just nuke them all. Like there was a group of people Black Wall Street, who literally a people group ran them all out. They burned a civilization to the ground, and in order to get rid of a certain people that were in this land, and that didn't work out so well. So the idea of just nuke them all kind of.
Yeah, I'll push back a little bit on that because it did work out for some of the white folks who lived in Tulsa at the time, because they were able to basically steal land, right? So these our Black brothers and sisters who lived in North Tulsa, and if you don't know anything about Tulsa, our church is 5 or 6 miles from where Greenwood is. It's not far at all. We are in the heart of Midtown Tulsa, and they are in North Tulsa, so we are not far. We are neighbors. Not adjacent neighbors, but we're close neighbors to the Greenwood district. During that period of time, Black men and women who had businesses and tailor shops and meat markets and insurance companies, and I mean, name it, they had it. It was their own, this Black Wall Street that they called it. It was a flourishing and vibrant part of Tulsa. If you can call it a race riot, Rich, what happens is your insurance that you've been making payments on for decades to make sure that your business, if something happens, a fire or a burglary or earthquake happens, that insurance covers that loss. If you can call it a race riot, there is almost always a rider in your insurance policies that says that they do not cover damage as a result of a riot specifically. So initially it was called a race riot to make sure that people could not collect insurance money. They could not rebuild. And as a result, white citizens of Tulsa took over. And not only that, but they... decades later, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, there became the separation between North Tulsa, which there were still some Black inhabitants, and the more southern part of Tulsa from downtown further south. So much so that they were able to build a raised highway right as a divider between North Tulsa and the rest of Tulsa, with very few accesses between North and South Tulsa. They literally mounded hundreds and hundreds of tons of dirt on what used to be Black men and women's property that was stolen from them and then never allowed to be rebuilt on. And then a highway was put on it to make sure, like, we own you. This is our side of town. That is your side of town. You stay there and there won't be any problems, right? So there kind of was a winner. And sadly, like the way they went about it, it was awful.
It's terrible.
Here's what's interesting. I found out a bit of, and I know that we're going way off topic here, but I found out a bit of my own family history that my great-grandfather owned a business in downtown Tulsa, probably right around that period of time, up through the 1950s, 50s, I think. Well, I say that. I think it was owned and functioned up until the 70s, maybe, where they were a photo engraving. I don't know much about it other than they put titles on photos and things like that. So he owned a building downtown. It was not too terribly far from where the race massacre happened. And we have this, you're right, like if there's a problem, I'll solve it, check out the hook while the DJ revolves it, and then we'll murder everybody, right? Like we will just, if there is a problem, we will get to the root of it by ousting these people. We'll send them from the East Coast into the Central Plains. We will burn down their businesses and their homes. We will eradicate them from the face of the earth, right? This is the same conversation that happened in the 1940s with the Jews to begin with. I don't know how this anti-Semite mentality happened, but the Jews were almost eradicated. 6 million we know of were murdered as a part of World War II. And almost as a, I don't know, like an afterthought to World War II after, the big governments, America, the British, the Americans, the French versus the Soviets, we began to split up the German Empire. We almost were like, I guess the Jews, who were kind of the receiving end of all the hate and violence and murder, let's create a land for them in a space that we don't own. I think at the time the French and British, did have some sort of a colonial interest in that area of the world, and they promised to give it to the Israelis, even though it wasn't really their. There's just so it's all just so convoluted. But kind of moving back to what we've seen, Rich, I know that you talked about some people who made a stand for Israel, right? So you have this kind of celebrity culture where these folks made a stand with Israel. And tell me about that meme that you saw.
Yeah, so it was kind of it was on TikTok, and it started off with out of all of the ones I've seen, this one hurt the most, and it proceeded to be a kind of a slideshow of screenshots of different celebrities who had posted, "I stand with Israel. I stand with Israel." The last one, I believe, was Mark Hamill. It was someone like that, some very high profile celebrity, and it really got me to think, like, man, sometimes standing with Israel can be not a detriment, but you're taking sides. You're, by doing that, you are hurting people. Well,
and it's really interesting to think about the, again, I mentioned it earlier, but we are more divided in America than we've really been in my whole lifetime. And just so you know, I'm super young. I'm all the young. But, we are living in a world where we've stopped listening to one another. We've stopped having conversation with one another. And instead, we launch grenades from one side of the aisle to the other at other people. And so when you make a stand like that, you are literally ostracizing. You can count on 38 to 52. Those are numbers that are so true. I just pulled them out of the air. But when you make a stand for anything, you have to understand that when you take a stand for something, there is a correlation to what you've taken a stand against. And so these Palestinians who call America home, when they see some people that they've watched on TV, people who have mentored them in business or in life, when they see them taking a stand for Israel, who they really have no connection to other than through Scripture,
right?
It's hurtful, and it does, like you say, it causes harm. It may not be a detriment to them, but it does show them that they are valued less. And I couldn't imagine hearing that. And so again, let's be clear. I'm a white guy. And there are very few times in my life where I have ever felt slighted or felt discriminated against. I'll tell you one quick story. I went to a seminary, and I won't name it, but it is a very conservative seminary, and I am not conservative. I'm not liberal. I'm not conservative. I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm a moderate Christian. And because I was staying with the United Methodist Church throughout the disaffiliation process that's been going on since 2019, at this seminary, I was a target. Anytime that conversations were brought up about unity in the United Methodist Church, there was always conversation that was quasi-disingenuous, talking about how, many people are splitting from the Methodist Church because of, liberal pastors, and the clergy doesn't believe in the divinity of Jesus anymore, and we're going to take the Christian creeds out of the Book of Discipline, and we're whatever. These really weird accusations were being cast at the United Methodist Church, even though the only way a United Methodist Church could legally disaffiliate from our denomination was by claiming it had to do with human sexuality. Based on paragraph 2553 added in 2019, that was it. It was the only way you could disaffiliate and keep your property. And so I literally felt like I was a target at seminary, and withdrew last semester because I couldn't sit there and continue to be treated, and as I now recognize, some people who believe differently or look differently are treated. I removed myself from that situation, and luckily, as a white guy, I can just basically blend in anywhere.
Sure.
Whereas if you have a different skin tone, you are going to be potentially discriminated against just by optics, just by people looking at you.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't think that we can even come to fully understand the harm that is done when we stand with people and against others. But I can't imagine being either a Palestinian or an Israeli right now. And, the numbers are coming out, and it's saying that both groups, both Muslims in America and, Jews in America, are receiving all kinds of hate and death threats and just awful hurt because of a war that really doesn't impact us as Americans much at all.
Yeah.
And again, I think it stems from that unhealthy relationship that we have with a country that is so far away, just because Scripture tells us that they are our ancient brothers and sisters, right? And just because they are our ancient, connected, Abrahamic family, it doesn't mean they always do things right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean the Palestinians always do things wrong, and the vice versa is also true. It doesn't mean that Israelis are always in the wrong, and it doesn't mean Palestinians are always in the right. The truth is always somewhere in between.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Rich, what do you think the right response is for us as Christians in America right now in the midst of this heated debate on Israel and Palestine?
I think it's important to just let people know that we're in the middle. We stand with both sides, and we don't stand with any side. We are praying for both, and we very much have a heart for both people, right? We obviously we're not on the side where we're choosing to bomb one side or the other. We are taking the stance of saying that we are a peaceful, Christ following people, and that that means that we are against war, and against again, not to say we're against defending ourselves. That's not the question here. It's not the topic. But as Christians, I think our stance should be that whatever people group you think of, like, ask the questions. Always ask questions and say, is the narrative that we're being told always the full story? And it's not. So
it never is.
Yeah, it's not. And so that's I think that's our response is to ask questions and make sure that we're digging a little deeper, and then to just say, a one size fits all kind of response, like I stand with Israel. Ask the question, say, are we really supposed to just quote unquote stand with Israel?
That's really wise. I will go one step further than that, Rich. I would say that for us as Christians, we should absolutely, unequivocally stand against the actions of Hamas and their unprompted attack on Israelis and
Yeah.
the folks that were out there at that gathering in the desert.
Yeah.
And we should also be unequivocally against any indiscriminate launching of rockets into general populations.
Mm-hmm.
Hospitals should not be bombed. Schools should
Mm-hmm.
not be bombed. People should not live in fear
Mm-hmm.
just because they are Palestinian.
Mm-hmm.
People, in Israel should not be, living in fear because they're Israeli and they're afraid of Hamas might launch another attack. It's just awful. So any preemptive strikes that have been done, I think, are evil and wrong. And again, I think you're right. I think all of us have the opportunity to defend ourselves, but man, we have to be cautious in that defense because
Mm-hmm.
Jesus himself said, turn the other cheek. And that's not to
Mm-hmm.
say, let other people run over you. There's a bit of, in that phrase, there's a whole, a bit of dishonor because there's a conversation about, well, if they slap your other cheek, if you turn to them your other cheek, they have to hit you with the backside of their hand, which is a dishonor to them. So, Jesus is still saying like there should be honor in our response, but we can't defend ourselves in a way, I think, that causes mass death and indiscriminate killing.
Mm-hmm.
And I say we, I don't, we are not affected, right? Like this is the thing that we have to realize.
Yeah.
In America, Israelites, Israelis, Palestinians, they are not us. The battle that they're fighting is not us. It's not Christians against, Muslims here.
Yeah.
It is at this point strictly a territory issue. And don't get me wrong, what's weird is we have 3 of the world's largest religions have the same connection to that land because all 3 of our religions, both the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, we all have holy sites there. And until we're willing to give everyone free access and the ability to participate in the pilgrimages that take place and the hajjs that take place and the different things that call religious practitioners back to that land. And until we're able to allow them to be there freely, there's going to continue to be this fight over land and places.
Yeah.
And I don't know that any life is worth land.
Right.
And it's just such a hard place to be. So while we don't stand with either Israel or Palestine, we do in fact pray for both of them. We stand against Hamas unequivocally because of their actions.
For sure.
That were unprovoked.
Yeah.
And we love both our Muslim and Christian brothers and those who are not religious at all, who are just trapped in this war. And sorry, I forgot to mention our Jewish brothers and sisters who are also there.
Yeah.
There's a lot that we haven't addressed. We've not talked about the Zionist movement that happened post-World War II. We've not talked about some of the incredible bombings and harm that was done in the 80s and 90s. We've not talked about the assassinations. We've not talked about the change of power because no one can address all of these things in one simple setting. So if you are getting your news from a news source, one, you're doing it wrong, right?
Yeah.
Fox isn't going to have all the answers. CNN isn't going to have all the answers. We need to be balanced, and we need to be able to listen to both sides of these arguments so that we are prepared to defend our stances on things.
Yeah.
Not just about this conflict, but also about every other issue that impacts us as humans.
Yeah.
We need to have a wide variety of sources. So I'm going to continue to preach that message until we can get back to a place in America where we are once again listening to one another and able to have conversation rather than just throwing grenades like I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
But I hope that this conversation about what's going on in Israel between the Israelis and the Palestinians, between Hamas and the Israeli government helps. I know that that this is not the end of the conversation. This is just a starting point. But we would love for you to reach out to us. If you have questions, feel free to email us, visit us at our website, communitybrookside.com, and make contact with us because we'd love to know your heart. And hopefully we have said just enough to offend both sides and enough to tell you that we care deeply about all sides of conflict. So we would love to know your thoughts. Feel free to reach out to us. But Rich, as always, this is it's good to be in conversation. And my hope with this conversation is that the people who are listening for a place to stand, for a solid opinion to have, might listen to this and consider this another option. We don't have to stand for or against.
Yeah.
We can just stand for all humanity.
Yeah.
So.
I love it. I think, and that's great, the way that we can sit down and talk about this. I know I've mentioned it to you several times, but I think as a whole, the Christian community does a terrible job with disagreements.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, we're too busy throwing grenades at each other. Truly, like, it's okay to disagree. It's okay to have a different stance.
Yep.
We were all raised differently. Even though you and I may have several aspects that we agree upon, because we actually
grew up in the same community.
We did. We grew up just about 15 minutes from here, and it's so we have a lot of the same backgrounds, but even so, we still have disagreements, and we still have different backgrounds. We weren't raised the exact
in the same family, right, with the same social context.
Yeah. So we're still going to have things that we just see through a different lens, and that's always okay.
If nothing else, I hope that with this podcast we can present another lens through which people can hear and understand the workings of the world, and how we as Christians can respond. Yeah. I'm not going to say that we should all exactly do what you and I say and just kind of take this middle ground.
Yeah.
But I want to present it as an option, as an alternative to extremism on either the right or left. There is a middle ground.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's popular at this point in history, but I think it's valuable and important.
Yeah.
So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up today, Rich. But I hope you guys will come back and join us for more. We're going to shoot another podcast here really soon, talking about what Christian culture looks like and how sometimes it can be damaging to our souls. So stay tuned for more coming from Community Brookside in our podcast. We hope to hear from you soon. If you're in the Tulsa area, always feel free to drop by. We would love to see you. Make sure you like and share our content. It helps us get the word out about a valuable position in the Christian culture today, one of the middle, and we will catch you on the next one. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's Community Cast. We hope that you were blessed by today's conversation. If you'd like to know more about Community Brookside, please feel free to visit us at our website, communitybrookside.com, or find us on your favorite social media outlet. We hope to hear from you soon. Be blessed.